So on Tuesday we took a look at that pathway called adaptation. We had a good discussion about the past and about the future, our hopes and our fears, and how we navigate a path forward with the increasing prospect of cataclysmic climate change and species loss. But today we're having a look at our material culture, which maybe has a larger number of people that are directly involved. This shows the UK's cumulative carbon emissions from 1750 to today. And we're kind of conditioned to think that where we are is normal, and it's easy to forget how unusual our country is. Scotland gave the world the Enlightenment, which told us nature's a machine for us to harness. That made our country rich. But the wealth wasn't simply a product of exploiting our own labour and natural resources. We were a militarised society that exploited the labour and resources of a third of the world. Those Georgian town houses were furnished with tropical hardwoods that was paid for in guineas, and they were called guineas because the gold came from West Africa.
By 2026, the EU, 27 and UK construction sectors use up their fair share of the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. So within 1,000 days, all carbon emitted by our construction sector is essentially colonisation afresh. It is taking from the rest of the world that we have already stolen from. When we've talked about sustainability up to this point, what we've really meant quite quietly is damage control. So it's about going towards that regenerative. So how can the activities that we do in the built environment do ecological and social good rather than simply not make things worse than they already are, because things are actually quite terrible. We cannot talk about a just transition in Scotland without recognising there can be no new oil and gas, and we've been told this by every climate scientist who knows what they're doing for the past 5 years. Scotland's greatest untapped resource is not North Sea oil, it's the transformational capacity of our homes, streets, neighbourhoods. We have all this infrastructure that is not working for us. Why not reimagine it and do it very differently?
The biggest substance that we use as a species after water, concrete, and even if there's some magical science that means we can have zero carbon cement, the world has a global sand crisis. The UN has declared sand an endangered natural resource, and it just doesn't make sense in a circular economy to cover sand with cement. So we just need transformative change. Charting the decline of the use of cement and investing that money in new biomaterials.
Do we need to have a VAT on just virgin new materials coming into the system, but then once they're in the system, they're already there?
Well, it's embodied carbon tax you need there, but which is talked about a lot, but I don't know, I mean, the people around the table probably know more than me about that.
Could we introduce an embodied carbon tax?
We can, yes.
Right, fine.
Yes, we can, definitely.
At the moment, we are building toxic pollution boxes, polybag wrapped, with arsenic in the timber we use, with cyanide in the insulation we use, with polythene wrapped around everything. The people who died in Grenfell died from cyanide poisoning, not the flames.
It's going to be like the issue we've had with asbestos
to the power of 100 in terms of how to take them apart, how to deal with them, how to try and safely tuck them away and detoxify the built environment. So this is how we build vapour open, exposed timber, massive timber, but we need to persuade our big industrial conglomerates that they need to add value to Scottish timber, not just turn it into pallets.
I've seen what happens when people care on a building site, when people are given space to learn and to teach and to use materials that we know are not toxic. This stuff is already happening. It's just about celebrating it and enacting this new materials culture. It is not simply going to be a case of we have these solutions, we're going to force them on people. All of this has to be invitational. We've seen what it looks like when we have an unjust transition. We've watched our agriculture be torn apart, we have seen shipyards shut down, we have seen mines closed, and we've seen what happens when people are left behind.
Our office is working on a really kind of great project in Ulster, so just outside Belfast, the Ulster Folk Museum. So we've been looking at innovation in, for example, using straw bale construction. So straw bale cassette panels that can be fully demounted. The suppliers that we can get for that type of product are based in Europe, but it's materials that can exist in the Scottish-Irish context. So I think having those as demonstrator projects to show what can be done using those materials that can be produced locally is really of interest to us as a practice. So.
If architects are specifying materials, then that's what it will be built by, right?
They would love to specify these materials, but often it's very cost driven by the clients. It's the clients that need to be educated, and yes, the architects need to educate the clients, but it's so cost driven, and okay. There's also a focus on using very large manufacturers who are measurable, risk-free. So using small local companies, which we should be doing, it becomes difficult.
I've got a conversation this afternoon with the landscape architects about how do we build this ramp without using concrete, and they're like so oppositional to it.
Taking the circular economy, trying to get products in a consistent and volumetric manner needs a bit more flexibility in the system to allow something to still be taken as consistent. Rip up the BBA process, that's just way too expensive. Not for the sake of, I don't want to make more risk out of not having tested materials, but the process you have to go to get new things to market so that architects, clients, warranty providers, structural engineers will accept things that aren't concrete for ramps needs to be completely rethought.
For me, what's really important in the just transition, moving away from an oil-based economy, is a move back to more traditional natural materials, including plant-based materials, which is what our company does. So Indi-Nature makes natural fibre insulation from materials like traditional hemp and jute and flax that capture carbon, and they're good for people's health and good for buildings. I'm one of the founders of Indi-Nature. We research and develop innovative bio-based materials using natural fibres, primarily for the construction industry, but also other markets. And we manufacture on scale, so we have a mill in Jedburgh on the Scottish borders. It's a local crop, and it's manufactured locally as well. My background was in community development, and I was working with people in fuel poverty and saying, this is terrible, how are people living in cold, damp homes in the 21st century? How can we build better? So I did a postgrad in sustainable architecture and learned about all these benefits of natural materials. Then I did a retrofit of my own house, but I had to get wood fibre insulation that was manufactured in a factory in Poland, selling it, which came from Italy. But what we saw there was a market gap. Why is nobody doing this on scale in the UK? So that's why we set the company up. We wanted to make the largest possible impacts we could on people's health and the climate. The only way to do that was to do it on an industrial scale. Most of you are aware of the massive challenges in the construction industry. It's taking about half of natural resources. A lot of that is non-renewable. About half of global carbon emissions, and about half of landfill around the world. Massive, terrible impacts. So the solution that we have with our products is we're using fast-growing renewable resources. We can grow our crops within a year, and they capture carbon very, very quickly. There's lots of benefits to natural fibre insulation. They're good for people's health because there's no toxins in them. They breathe vapour out, so naturally, just like our historic buildings did. And they work in sympathy with historic traditional buildings, keeping them dry and healthy, keeping the stones dry and the timbers dry. Dundee used to have 100 textiles mills, 100 jute textiles mills. And they started as flax mills because flax was grown locally in Dundee. All that shifted to India eventually, cheaper labour, but also the jute was grown there. So it's also a good feeling knowing that we're reviving these natural traditional fibres in the UK. So we're growing the supply chain for hemp and flax. And we even hired some people who used to work on the old mills.
We're involved with, so the guys are speaking this afternoon, we were talking about the new hemp insulation, and it's taken, I mean, in my terms, quite a long time to go from we've got something we've all worked out at the university to literally, I think it was last week, they finally got their full certification for this is a usable building product in Britain.
It's terribly easy to keep doing the same thing, and it's very difficult to break that and go for the products which might be slightly more expensive but then cost less in terms of environmental impact. And that's, I think, where R&D is really important, as in because the industry is commercially driven, it is a free market economy type system. It's very hard, therefore, for new products to become accepted, and we need a lot of R&D. We need state funding to shift the direction a little bit.
Find out who is required to speed that up, and then what is that conversation looking like, and ramping up the body of voices that are saying this is too slow. That's how we would respond to that.
We need to try to find a way of stimulating relevant research and development. If universities are, every few years they have to go through this research excellence framework kind of thing, and submit all their research, and if they don't get any points because the research doesn't seem relevant, money doesn't come from government into that department. And we end up with a situation where departments say, oh, well, we're not going to do any research, we'll just take on more students for more fees.
Early stage design, we quite often come up against early stage costs being the point at which innovation or natural materials or things like that are kind of cut out of the project on a basis of them being worried about giving advice to a client that they then are on the chopping block for sort of later in the process.
Do we need another full demonstrator like the Glasgow House that Glasgow School of Art did in Glasgow to allow people to experience different forms, different ways of building, and have an open air museum of different build systems?
Like artificial intelligence is going to help make us make better decisions, and things like you're talking about at that very early stage. If I want to do X, Y, and Z, what's it going to be to the energy demand of the building? What's it going to be to the embodied carbon of those materials? And trying to kind of push that side of it forward. I think there's a real need for some sort of tool that will help you with that decision making, to say, well, if I change to Indi-Nature's hemp, what's that going to do to budget, embodied carbon, whole life carbon?
The projections internationally is for a massive market growth in mass timber usage. With solid timber or engineered timber like this, we're locking up lots of carbon for the life of a building and beyond if we reuse the materials. We're seeing it all around the world. We're seeing it in Australia, United States, Canada, France, Netherlands, all sorts of places, except here. And everywhere is opening factories at a rate of knots to manufacture from the local resources, except here. And all over the states, they're changing regulations state by state to encourage greater use of timber. They've had a Mass Timber Act to encourage more use of timber in tall buildings. They have universities changing their curricula. It's happening really at speed, and that's my point. We're talking about what we need to do at speed. Everybody else is doing it at speed.
We need to look around and say, what's best practice in other places? How are they doing it? and what are the methods? Because obviously other governments and different things have looked at all of this. Industry drives it in terms of what are the things we need. Now we've got big sawmilling groups in Scotland. I mean, we have a big industry, but they produce pallets and potato boxes and fence posts. Mm-hmm. You know, getting them to do something that requires longer term investment, that requires a different kind of attitude to manufacturing, they're not really interested. You know, and that's been the experience for a long time. We're falling behind the rest of the world in many respects.
We import more than 80% of our construction materials in timber, which is just crazy, and post-Brexit even crazier. We need regulations. Regulatory change is the one thing that the industry responds to, construction industry responds to, and it does take often regulations to force change to happen.
The construction sector probably will continue doing what it's doing until a product or products come along which are cheaper. So I think you need the regulation and the incentives to sort of artificially shift that in the early stages in that first sort of 5 to 10 years, and then probably the sector's moved, the products are using a different, the education system's caught up and sort of is educating people in that way as well.
In Germany and France and so on, you get paid euros per kilogram of bio-based materials that you're using.
Hardwood LVL, laminated veneer lumber, is 3mm strips of wood. All the grain of the wood goes in the same direction, but when it's put together, it's a different kind of construction process, because you don't take a log and cut boards out of it. You unroll a log and peel it, and when you peel it, instead of the 65% yield you get from a log for normal building work, you get about 95%, so you're left with something like a broomstick at the end of the peeling process, and you get this continuous sheet. You can either cut into sections, or you can make very long panels of wood which can twist, turn, bend, go in all directions. In Scotland, we've got the biggest glue lamin LVL building in Britain, and if you haven't been up to Craigellachie to see the McAulay distillery, you really should, because it's in many ways the most advanced building technologically in this country. In every piece of wood, every element of this had a barcode, came to site incredibly well, probably the best managed building set I've ever seen in this country in terms of really control of any minimal waste there was. The way in which the whole thing was constructed is an object lesson, it's a case study really in terms of how we could do things well. These guys in Sweden have been experimenting with LVL to make very thick LVL, curved sections. Instead of, when we put wind turrets here, wind turbines, we see enormously long steel tubes getting transported around the country with great difficulty. This is modular. You put them together in a factory, you bring it all to site, you can get multiples of these in a truck. Renewable energy systems, Scottish company, have ordered 200 of these from Sweden. We could be making them.
How much of the barriers in the UK do you think are down to the Grenfell tragedy and the repercussions of the regulations coming from that? Is that what's stagnating these materials?
They were stagnating before Grenfell, but I think Grenfell introduced regressive legislation afterwards, and that more than any other industry affected the timber sector, because there was a lot of buildings going up in London that were mass timber up to 10 stories. We were leading the world in that side of things for residential structures. So legislation came in for England and Wales that said above 18 metres, the whole wall build-up had to be non-combustible. To show the paradox of regressive legislation, you can still build a 20-storey mass timber building in London if it's commercial. The rules only apply to residential structures. I believe what we need is a Timber Innovation Act in Scotland that subsidises or incentivises education, research, particular building types, and so on to change the culture of construction.
I think there's probably a need for a materials policy in general. It's, we import so much of what we use, and basically there's more that we could be looking at what we can build and make from what we've got in Scotland.
In the kind of cascading approach, Do we continue to create cross-laminated timber, which is solid panels? Do we prioritise glue-lam frames with hemp created infill? How do we cascade the materials in a way that they are most effectively being used for the performances they have? Because we can get a lot of crops of hemp and other materials out of the fields in the next 20 years where you've only got really one tree cycle. So everybody likes to talk about planting trees, but I'd much rather see that mix, see that crop, see the benefits that come from rural just transition and supporting farming communities and fishing communities rather than just the mass landowners who have a large forest.
I think for me that's it. Without having a unified view of the natural industries, so fish, farm and forest, we kind of miss a trick. And I would argue you've got fish, farm and forest and you need to bring industrial biotechnology almost as a fourth pillar. So farm and forest are not directly competing, but there's only so much land to go around that's suitable for these different purposes.
We are now trying to compare these things and say, well, okay, yes, trees are good, hemp's good, but where? How much? And that exercise hasn't been done, and actually it's just starting to be, as far as I'm aware, Oxford University with some other universities are just starting to do the first matrix where you actually do start working out how much you need to be sustainable in food, to be sustainable in timber, and what should go where.